Hello and welcome from the Faculty of Education at Monash University in Melbourne. My name is Viv Ellis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty. First, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm speaking to you today and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. A very warm welcome to everyone who is live streaming this event on YouTube or watching later. You join us for the second series of Global Critical Conversations, events we've planned to take place entirely online and which are timed to maximise participation from viewers and listeners all the way around the world. Drawing on leading international experts as well as our partners here in Victoria and our own Monash education researchers, we want these critical conversations to stimulate a global dialogue about issues of central importance to education professionals and the wider public now and into the future. We had thousands of participants join us for our first series in 2020, and we know that there is a desire for the kind of open, non-technical discussion that this series is designed to foster. Global Critical Conversations focuses on key questions arising from our faculty's research agenda, with its overarching theme of fostering fair and sustainable futures. There are 5 sub-themes that integrate the research strengths across our faculty, bringing together researchers from education, counselling and psychology. These sub-themes are reimagining educational leadership, transforming teaching and learning, shaping digital futures, educating for diversity and inclusion, and enhancing health and well-being. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Virginia Trioli, Australian journalist, author and broadcaster, and our facilitator for this second series of Global Critical Conversations.
This is the final Global Critical Conversation in the series, and I think it's really important that we don't complete this series without talking about the idea of inclusion. There's a heck of a lot of discussion around that. Pretty much any educational institution that you go to will have that language at the centre of what it claims to do and indeed what it wants to do. But how many of these institutions, how many teachers, how many organisations actually end up walking the talk? And that's the huge challenge. What are the barriers to inclusion after all these years and after all the billions of dollars spent in research and in putting together programs that apparently are trying to work towards fostering that inclusion? Are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? Let me introduce to you our really terrific panel to talk this through. Professor Nicole Reinhardt is with you, clinical psychologist from Monash Education, and who has done amazing work creating Allplay, which I know she's going to speak to you about at some point this evening as well. Chris Varney is with you as well from the ICANN Foundation. ICANN Network is Australia's largest autistic-led organisation, and it provides group mentoring to autistic young people through school and online programs. Chris, great to have you there as well. Professor Jonathan Delafield-Butt is with you as well, a developmental scientist in child development and autism at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in Scotland, city where a lot of attention has been focused over the last few days, and I might manage to slip in a question about that as well, I think. Nithya Purnima is with you as well, clinical psychologist in child and adolescent health from Bangalore in India. Great to have you on board, Nithya. Thank you so much for being there. Associate Professor Rajuta Wilson is here too from the University of California, Los Angeles in the United States. Rajuta, a real pleasure to have you. And Dr. Simon Moss as well, Charles Darwin University here in Australia too. And a big wave hello to Jenny Leonard, who is our artist, our live scribe for our chat today. And she's been illustrating all of our conversations. So make sure she's called up on the screen there, and she'll give you thumbs up from time to time as well to show that she's listening to every single word. Chris Varney, I'm just going to get you to start, if you can, with a little bit of an explainer about the language that we'll be using in our conversation.
Thank you very much, Virginia. It's an honour to be here. My name's Chris, pronouns are he, him. So tonight everyone will be using a language which means something to them, something that's representative of the group that they're representing here tonight. In autism, the discourse globally is in different stages of maturity and development. And there's no judgment of the different dialects that people are using tonight. To call it out, practically on autism, there's an identity-first approach where someone might say that they're autistic, or there's a person-first approach where someone might say person with autism, student with autism, student on the autism spectrum. All of those are fine tonight. The different presenters will be using different ones as they feel fitting for the communities they represent. For example, tonight I'll be using identity-first language. So we're all embracing of the different languages that people will be using tonight.
Thanks so much for that. The language can get in the way sometimes, so it's great to know that all terminologies, all welcome, whatever makes most sense and is comfortable for you. Let's start off with trying to get our other definition right and actually sort of getting over, I think, one of the big stumbling blocks, which is what we actually mean by inclusion. And as I referred before, it has become something of a buzzword, and I suspect in many educational settings, maybe even close to meaningless these days. So Simon, I'll get you to kick that off. What do we mean by inclusion? And let's hear from everyone on that, and let's see if we actually have a consensus view on that.
Well, thanks, Virginia. Well, interestingly, the definition of inclusion seems to have shifted really quite dramatically in the last decade or two. Now, I know definitions aren't particularly interesting for some people. Few people spend Saturday night reading the dictionary, but the history of this definition really is quite fascinating, because the reason is that throughout history, there's many inspiring leaders and movements believe that society should include everyone, like every gender, every ethnicity, every level of ability and so forth in various opportunities and events, from sporting competitions and management boards. And to achieve this goal, the prevailing approach to inclusion was to try to treat everyone as the same, and in essence, to dismiss the differences between genders, ethnicities, and so forth, almost to pretend that everyone was identical. But then researchers uncovered a really concerning insight, and that's when people attempt to disregard the differences between or across individuals. Besides not catering to these differences very well, they actually become even more sensitive and aware of these differences. So they perceive differences between, say, people who were diagnosed with autism and those that won't as even more pronounced than they would have otherwise. And that actually can exacerbate prejudices. So since this time, rather than dismiss differences between people, inclusion has become much more about, I think, embracing diversity and differences. That is, inclusion is more about recognizing that such diverse perspective, experiences, and characteristics are fundamentally and quintessentially desirable, something we cherish. And that inclusion and diversity is sort of now regarded as more like as intriguing, as enlightening, as productive by improving creativity, and ultimately as fair.
Okay, thank you for that. Nicole, can I get you to step in here as well? Is that as you see it playing out by the lived experience of autistic children?
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever I think about inclusion, the first port of call for me is to ask the person who is not being included, for example, how would you like to be included? If we think about inclusion as everybody in a group, for a child with autism, they might not like that. It was a great example recently of that was published in a PhD study of a young person at school who didn't want to participate in PE class, physical activity, and that's really, really common. I think Rajuta will probably talk about some of the motor challenges a little bit later on. And so the teacher took a great approach of letting the young person develop their own PE program, and this young person developed the program, measured the outcomes, and lo and behold, by the end of the term, had won the award at the school for the most improved fitness. And so for that person, being included was about being able to participate in the way that they want to participate. And I think this story is instructive in two different ways. It's a great example of a teacher creating the social conditions for multiple ways of participating, that participation isn't just one way. And importantly, I think the other take home from this little story is that it tells us that inclusion isn't just a good thing, it's actually vital for physical and mental health, for people to be able to participate how they want.
I want to turn to you if I can, Chris Varney. Do you think in most educational settings, schools and the like, are agreed or have a similar view on inclusion to what end, what the actual end is, and the meaning of inclusion is?
Great question, Virginia. It's a complex one. I think in the leadership of different departments of education in the Australian context, there's a big aspiration about including a diverse range of students and diverse autistic identities. Unfortunately, autistic students and their families face huge structural discrimination across the schooling system. It's a complex web of financial discrimination. It's involving very rigid funding systems that don't have a good understanding of what the conditions are. So schools, it's a highly sometimes immovable thing, education, and it requires adjustments in pedagogy, curriculum. And when we don't have a good understanding of what these conditions are, and we don't have an education personnel who've been well versed on what these conditions are, the system's a bit stuck. So in Australia, we've got jurisdictions all at different places with how they understand autism, dyslexia, other neuro conditions. And as a result, they're all in different places. I think the aspirations is there, but there's still a funding system all with 8 different stories across Australia.
Jonathan, can I get your reflection on what you think we mean by inclusion? And I'm very happy for you all to leave yourselves unmuted if you like. It just gives you a bit more flexibility with jumping in if you desperately feel you need to. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with the previous speakers or discussants on the definition of inclusion, especially what Nicole pulled out as a kind of development from what the history that Simon was talking to us about. I mean, inclusion is about adapting to the individual child and including that child or that student in terms of adult education as well, in the way that they see best. And that often means adapting the educational system, the pedagogy, or the curriculum to fit that particular child. And as Chris has said, educational systems can be immovable, big, fixed, rigid structures that are not very quick to adapt. So that can be, quite a challenge, I think, for these systems to adapt and for individual teachers to try to adapt for inclusion in their particular classroom or school. When you have these, rather rigid regimens that they have to follow. So inclusion absolutely must be child-centered. It must follow the aspirations of the particular individual, and to include them in the way that they see fit and that they are most comfortable.
Nithya, what would you like to add to that?
Yes, I agree that it is important to acknowledge the individual need, and that's what inclusion strives for. And probably what we lack at the moment is a good enough grasp of diversity and how it operates in the human species, and particularly in group settings, such as educational spaces. So I think putting all of that together gives us a sense of what inclusion could be and what it is now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Nithya, your observation about, the different versions of what inclusion actually is. And I just want to loop back, if I can, Rajuta, to the idea of inclusion to what end? Because sometimes when you see an inclusion policy or approach play out in an educational setting, it's not exactly clear whether it's the child, him, her, themselves, who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this, the school, or in what forms they're even supposed to be the beneficiaries. I often find that trying to get to an understanding of, an inclusion model to what end is actually sometimes a very troubling thing to try and understand. I think that the straight line that it can be can sometimes get lost along the way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, I'll comment on that, but sort of backtracking a little bit, or thinking about what some of the others have said in this group, in this conversation. I sort of think of inclusion, and I think Jonathan, Nicole, Chris have said this in a way, is fostering a sense of belonging, right? It's really thinking about how can that child, individual, feel as if they belong within all the activities that are typically available to most individuals or most children. So this sort of idea of inclusivity is understanding what the individual needs are, but also what is predominantly generally offered in these settings, and how do we accommodate both of those things. I think another sort of comment on, in addition to what Chris was saying, and this sort of brings me, and I think perhaps touches upon what you're bringing up here, and sort of that inclusion to what end, or how we describe these programs, how we offer these programs. I had an autistic young girl in my clinic, adolescent. I say young girl, she's adolescent. And she asked me, why is my support called special education? And why does my friend who gets physical therapy, who's not autistic, why is it called physical therapy? So why is that? Why shouldn't mine just be called physical therapy? Why shouldn't my program be called in that way? But at the same time, in her really deep understanding of the fact that there are certain differences as to what might be she needs compared to her friends. So I think maybe answering in a certain way of what you're describing, I think inclusion to what end is still really finding that balance between making all activities, programs available for all, but also what Simon was saying is understanding that there are differences and adaptations that might need to occur so that we don't further highlight those differences and difficulties, but we support them.
Yeah. Well, billions of dollars are invested in autism spectrum disorder and neurodevelopmental disorders research. So where does this leave our children? And Nithya, can I come to you on that? It's a heck of a lot of money. We should know a hell of a lot by now, do we?
Yes, there is a lot of research that's going on, and a lot of useful information has been gleaned from all of that research. But when we look at research on lived experiences, when we look at research that amplifies voices of young people on the spectrum or their families, we seem to have very little. And it seems to be a call for research of that kind, where we want to hear more and more from the community, where we want to learn, we want to be curious about this, not come from an expert position saying these are the deficits, this is what the condition is, and this is what a person or a child with the condition needs. Right? So I think it's wonderful that the attention is on the condition, but if we could broaden it to include lived experiences, I think it would make the journey much more meaningful for everybody involved.
We've got your line breaking up just a little bit there, Nithya, but Chantal, I'll just leave you to have a chat with Nithya if you feel you need to. Nicole, you wanted to jump in there too.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce what Nithya was saying, that despite billions of dollars of research and some very, very important medical research, the reality is that autistic children still are not living an ordinary life. And that's what we want for all of our children, for every child, just to live an ordinary life, go to school easily, join a sporting club easily, go to a dance class. In Australia, of course, we have the incredible National Disability Insurance Scheme, and at the heart of that, massive social reform is to build individual and community capacity so that we can live an ordinary life. And so it's interesting, I'm just reflecting that inclusion is both complex, as we've heard so far, but it's also so simple. And we're sitting between the complex and the simplicity. And I think we have to go back to simple things like, what is it that the collective voice of young people want and individuals? And I think we need a greater investment in community-based research to balance up the medical model. So we have a balance of the medical and the social model. We need both. We need all models and approaches.
I wanted to turn to Jonathan, that if I can. Clearly, the deficit model, and as Nicole has alluded to, the medical model, the medicalising, if you like, of ASD has served us well to some extent, because it's been important to establish those markers of, you know, what it is and what it isn't, and therefore establish some allied health practices that might be of service there. But is it starting to not serve us well enough? Do we need a shift in how we approach it and how we frame it?
I think that's right, Virginia. And I mean, the medical model's been hugely successful in many other conditions, and especially you know, biological pathologies and things like that. But in autism, which is a complex developmental psychological or neuropsychological concern, there is the complex, which is the neuropsychology of it and the genetics and the underpinning biology. But then there is the simple, which is the social. And even while the principles of the social are simple, putting those principles into action, rather a little bit more complex. But at the core of them, the principles, I think, are very simple. And the funding system, at least in the UK, has shifted so much towards favouring sort of the biomedical model with pharmaceutical outputs that can be monetized, you know, with a commercial product, a drug intervention, for example. That the social side of research has fallen into disfavor, and we don't invest enough in the social side. The biomedical side offers us great insight also into the basic nature of what it is to be a human mind, a human being. And that's a wonderful side product, as it were, of a pharmaceutical-driven or a medical-driven model and research. But we need to also invest in the social side. And I think this is what we're seeing here is a lack of balance, because the biomedical does not help us to understand how to work with each other in a social community, the kinds of questions that we're raising here. So I think we need to turn our attention towards it.
Simon Moss, did you want to jump in there as well, particularly in relation to the models that we're discussing here?
Yes, I agree. And I agree that there seems to be a real shift in research in the last sort of 5 to 10 years around the social side, partly because probably 20 years ago, there was this obsession with trying to identify what the fundamental, almost cause of autism was. We wanted to know the cause. We wanted to treat it. We sort of thought it's all about treatment and causes and those sorts of issues. And what we really discovered in the last few decades actually is that all of the sort of the biological markers and the genetic correlates of autism are very complex. In fact, they're not really observed in all people with autism. In fact, they're not even observed in the majority. And so it highlighted how complex the situation was. And that's actually, in some ways, it probably disappointed people who were seeking a simple treatment, but it probably encouraged everyone else who recognized the complexity and the fact that, you know, each individual is quite unique. There might be certain clusters and so forth of sort of biological correlates, but everyone is unique. And it started to then focus people on the unique experience. And so there was a lot more research then, for example, on how even just small changes in social skills or small changes in the way the parents responded to their children with autism could create quite dramatic shifts in that seemed quite fundamentally entrenched before that time.
Yeah, the issue is, of course, and we've seen this develop so strongly, and I know you could probably speak to this, Chris, as well, in terms of, you know, autistic self-advocacy, is that it moves you away from the concept of an autistic person needing to be fixed. And that's, when you make that leap, then you've made a massive leap, and you've actually redefined the entire conversation, haven't you, Chris?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you raised that. I mean, I must admit, 8 years ago, when I, as an autistic law graduate, I was aspiring to set up an autistic-led organisation, I had all sorts of friends in high places say that my idea would not pass a risk management plan, namely because they didn't think that autistic people could carry corporate duties. I mean, 8 years ago, there were so many misconceptions about what autistic people could and can't do. Yeah, and now 8 years later, here we are. You know, there's so much more accountability to creating and designing programs with autistic people. So that's I'm so relieved I'm not alone there, that there's a movement that's developed around that.
I wanted to go to Reducer in just a moment, but yes, jump in there, Nicole. You're on mute, Nicole. That's why I'm going to get you guys to unmute.
Okay, I'm not going to.
That's the last time I want to say you're on mute.
I knew it was going to be me.
2 years now, we don't need to do that again. Go, Nicole.
I wanted to echo what Chris had just said, and this is a fundamental problem we face every day, I think, and that is we just don't hold the bar high enough. The bar should be held high for everybody, whether you have autism or you don't have autism, and we're constantly underestimating the extraordinary contribution of autistic children.
Part of the challenge, it seems to me, is that, and this is not to pit disability against disability, not at all, but I know this, from the experience of autistic children who can, present as, well, people who don't understand autism may not know, what exactly is the problem here, and the behaviour itself is seen as, naughtiness or playing up or misbehaviour or the like. The kid who is struggling, physically and has a very nameable and identifiable physical disability is seen as a little hero on the footy pitch for getting in there on the wheelchair or the like, or the crutches or something like that, whereas the child with autism is seen as a difficult one who acts up and causes trouble because no one can actually see it. The medical model actually challenges us to reframe how we see and how we perceive disability, doesn't it, Rajuta? I mean, we actually need to understand that we can't always see the thing that is there and that is real. Our eyes may not help us.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that's a beautiful example, Virginia. And I think it's another reason, though, why when we talk about inclusivity and we talk about breaking down barriers to that, why education around this is really important to the broader community, to coaches, to providers of community-based programs, to teachers, to other families. And that kind of touches also back upon when we talk about our work and our research, or what Chris was mentioning, that including autistic individuals, when we design our research programs or design other programs, is just fundamentally important for us to better understand that whole spectrum, or that complex, sort of approach or thought process behind this. But you're completely right. I think sometimes, that's a lot of what I'm doing as a clinician, not as a researcher, but is that education around what autism is or isn't, I should say, or what maybe a child considers a strength, not something that is a weakness in how they perceive or how they engage with the world or with other activities. And I think once that's understood, and I think once that's learned, it's not only about just learning that, but I also think it removes, I don't know if this is the right word, but almost an element of fear from those who aren't as familiar with autism, if that makes sense. I engage with a lot of coaches given this sort of, and we'll speak to a little bit more about engagement and physical activity. And many of them say it's not that we don't want to be inclusive and, taking with a grain of salt, but how do we support an autistic individual? Do we need to do something different? Are we going to do the wrong thing that might hurt that individual or their family? And so I think when you really make it an important part of what you're doing to teach about this, to have the autistic individual teach and talk about it, then you're starting to remove some of those barriers that, honestly may even be invisible barriers. We don't even realize that we hold those barriers in our mind.
I've got some interesting comments that have come in. Panelists on this. A comment from Fiona McFadden, who says, I'm an early childhood teacher and feel a barrier is that people don't understand autism, just as you say, Rajuta. And if we've got that as a fundamental early block in terms of lack of information and ignorance, then you really can't proceed beyond that. So you're quite right. And this also from Penny Robinson, who I think is a fellow ICANN founder and ambassador, saying on research, nothing about us without us should apply. Autism CRCs and others are now doing more participatory research, which is great, involving autistics from the study design and the beginning. And it's just logical, isn't it, that you're actually going to end up with something that's more meaningful, Chris, if that's the case, and if you're designing the program as well.
Do you want me to make a comment on that?
Yeah, just briefly, if you can.
I think my quick comment would be, I guess, alongside this, it's important to talk about the idea of targets. to make people accountable and to spend public money in increasing autistic participation across education and other fields. I personally believe targets play a role. It's just something to think about. People have lots of different philosophies about targets.
Yeah, maybe we can get to that. I'll note that down. Let's try and get to that a little bit later. Rajuta, I want to come back to you. Why is it important from a motor physical standpoint that children with developmental challenges and disabilities participate in community-based physical activity programs? And how is it that those programs can end up supporting the child and the family as well? Just continuing with our community-based theme there, Rajuta.
Yeah, certainly. And, forgive me or feel free to sort of tailor me along. This is something I'm very passionate about and have engaged with Professor Reinhardt quite a bit. And so, I guess to answer that question, Virginia, I'll kind of give a little bit of a background on, why sort of led me into realizing actually how important this is. And that is that, when we talk about these physical activities or a lot of these organized physical activities or motor-based activities, it's also important to recognize that motor differences or difficulties or dysfunction, impairments, many different words used for this, have been quite well described in autistic individuals and really prevalent across a lifespan from early infancy through adulthood, actually with a very recent study coming out of Australia, doing a very large study showing that up to 30% of autistic individuals having these motor difficulties, almost as high as the rate of intellectual disability. And it's shown to be even higher in some studies. And these, if we think about it, these motor skills that we have, walking, writing, gesturing, running, are really a fundamental part of what we do every day and how we engage with the world. And for autistic children, or I should say all individuals, it's a fundamental part about being physically active, right? Or being healthy in a way as we engage in physical activity programs. And many of us know, probably just from own personal experiences, as well as many, many large studies, that physical activity is fundamentally good for you. It's good for mental health. It's good for, physical health. It's good for peer engagement and interaction. And so when we think about this, we have to realize the other end that autistic children have been shown again in research to be far less physically active than their peers without autism, many higher rates of sedentary behavior. And so what can that do? That can impact their physical health, as we described, sort of compounding medical issues like higher rates of obesity, higher rates of high blood sugar, high cholesterol. But as I also noted, it can also really impact that engagement with, your peers. And, and also I think as a clinician in looking at this, and I'll give a quick sort of anecdote. I was in my clinic visit yet again, young boy, we'll call him Josh. He's 7 years old. I was a follow-up visit with his mom. And I said, how's Josh doing? And, he's gone through ABA therapy now. We've recognized he has ADHD. We've treated that. He's in social skills therapy. What's going on? And Josh is there playing very happily. And mom says, no, I thought it was going well, but we had a meeting with his teacher the other day. And she said, well, during recess, Josh still sits and plays with his puzzle. He doesn't really engage with the other kids. And I'm about to ask the mother another question. And Josh speaks up and says, well, I can't keep up with the other kids.
Yeah.
I run with them, but I can't. So I play my puzzle. And that taught me a couple of things. One, never just talk to the parent, always talk to your child. I know that, but still really thinking about, sometimes we forget that we said, and we talk a lot about deficits. We talk a lot what they can't do, but let's talk about what they can do. And let's also hear from them. And that was really striking to me because along with all these things, you realize not just it impacts physical health, but it impacts those really important peer relationships. Right? At 4, 5 years, 6 years of age, what are these kids doing? They're often running around the playground. They're playing soccer or footy, in Australia. They're doing these different activities. And so what we realize from many different point of views, having them be able to participate or having community-based programs available for autistic individuals is not only important for physical health, for peer relationships, but I also think it's really tremendous to support the entire family and even siblings. And I can't tell you how many times in these programs that we hold at UCLA, these dance programs, these tennis programs, or even in the community that they've engaged, that I've had parents tell me I had no idea my child could do that. It is so nice to go on a Saturday and not go to a soccer game of so-and-so's, sister or brother, but to their game or to their dance activity. And now they have something that they can relate a little bit more to their sibling with or with their peers. And, honestly, I think beyond some of the other important factors that I mentioned, I think that positive sort of experience for the family, that confidence, can go far beyond in many other areas outside of this for that autistic individual. So, like I said, I'm happy to speak at length about this, but these are my initial thoughts and let other people chime in.
That's terrific to hear you speak that way. I follow a bunch of guys, I think they're from Seattle, called Asperger's experts, who have Asperger's themselves and who made the point, it was the first time I actually read it, and described autism and spectrum disorders as being like a sort of a body-wide dyslexia. Which was a really great sort of image for it, and the physical work that you got to do, the exercise, the fun, the exploration, the strength development that you get in order to try and reorder that body, or at least have that body do what you want it to do and respond in the way that any other child can, which I thought was a wonderful description. Jonathan, I know you do some really remarkable work and work with some terrific people on this, particularly in relation to the wearable and smart device games that you work with to characterize the motor disruption in autism spectrum disorder. Tell us a little bit about that work.
Well, it follows on similar from what Rajita was talking to us about. In autism, something that Nicole, in fact, first started off, and why I first became aware of Nicole's wider work in also encouraging physical activity for autistic children, is that there's a fundamental and subtle but significant motor disruption in autistic individuals. And that motor disruption, what we've found, can be recorded and measured from simple things like iPad gameplay. So kids, when they engage with an iPad, they create certain motor patterns. Their interests, of course, guide this certain gross behavior of their gameplay when they're playing any game on an iPad. But underneath that gross behavior is a motor signature. And so what we've been doing is looking at trying to identify that computationally. What this means is that if the study bears out, and we're doing a phase 3 diagnostic trial right now to try to prove this point, but if the study bears out, we can identify autism in 3-year-old children from their iPad gameplay using machine learning and deep learning algorithms. That can be quite helpful because it means that teachers or parents or clinicians who might get stuck with a diagnostic pathway that's quite long and arduous can get some early indicators that, in fact, this child might be autistic and therefore, not acting out or being disruptive in the classroom because of any behavioral issues, but actually something that's more fundamental to their psychological structure. So that's one thing, is that you can use this motor signature, the motor difference in autism, to be able to potentially identify autism early, and that could go back to infancy, which would be great. But I think it speaks to a wider point about the conversation here, which is that the children with autism are moving fundamentally a little bit differently than neurotypical individuals. And this is very subtle. It's at a sub-second level of motor planning and control during the ongoing motor action itself. What that means a little bit deeper is that the expressive movement, so the way that I communicate my feeling, my intentions, if I'm feeling secure or insecure about a situation, aggressive or nurturing, caring, these are all conveyed through subtle shifts in the tension of a movement or the movement of the voice to convey feeling, right? And that feeling is what the other person perceives and feels, the receiver, the teacher, or the other kids in the playground. They feel the feeling in that person's movement. Now, if it's subtly different in autism, there's going to be a subtle difference in the feeling that's received in the partner. And that can create a kind of dissonance, a sense of, well, I don't quite understand this feeling because it's different. It's not the way that I would move or express myself or feel in this situation. And therefore, there's a gap that's created. And that gap, I think, can be subtle, but I think it can also be quite a major significant barrier in terms of getting inclusion right and getting the kinds of play situations right. So when Rajuta talks about the Allplay program or any physical activity program in schools, it's starting to kind of get the children in step with each other, and despite their neurodiverse differences, they're playing in step with each other and they're getting to know each other, and that creates trust and understanding, bonding, friendships, companionship, and leads to social skill development, learning, and then a confidence to go into the classroom and sit down still and listen to the teacher. Yeah, so I think movement is really at the heart of autism, and what we can do in terms of working better in terms of inclusive settings with autism.
It's a perfect description of how that barrier to inclusion is deeply embedded, you know, in the finest and earliest expressions of movement. And I'm sure if we have autistic people in our lives, we have seen that from infancy and from, you know, toddlerhood, just that slight difference, strangeness in movement. And children are heat-seeking missiles in detecting that in other kids, whether, you know, it's bang on and, you know, correct or not, and everything flows from that. Nithya, did you want to jump in there and add something to that? That was a wonderful description by Jonathan. What would you add to that?
I'm just going to turn off my video to see if the audio is better.
It is better, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I'm reminded of the many, many young children I've seen in the clinic. And often because it's a new place, there are so many strangers moving so much. They're rocking, they're kind of on their feet, they're jumping up and down, and it causes the parents so much distress. And when we sit down and talk to them, they say, you know, this is so odd. Everybody looks at the child, they know something is different. So they keep shushing the child to say, you know, sit still and sit still. And then when you sit down and talk to them and say, what do you think is actually happening? What's making them rock and jump now, as opposed to, let's say, half an hour before? They are able to see. They are able to see that the child is trying to regulate their discomfort. They are trying to make themselves more comfortable. And therefore, it's not that they don't see it, but to be able to advocate that on behalf of the child becomes such a struggle for parents. And therefore, then they also get isolated from the community. There are so many families which stop going to social gatherings, who stop taking their children out to play spaces because it attracts so much of uncomfortable attention. You know, the attention is not helpful either for the child or for the family. And so when we speak about movement as such a fundamental way of expressing oneself and regulating oneself, and that then becoming a barrier for the child and the family to just be and to give themselves just normal experiences that any other child or family could have. And it's deeply, deeply disturbing. And therefore, programs like the Allplay bringing in a lot of hope, you know, that this is possible, that for a neighborhood, for a community to be open and to be inviting for families with children who are neurodiverse, and that it need not be such an arduous process. And really the wish is that more and more of this happens. If we had, like in India, if I just took a walk around and looked at play spaces, it's hard to say that many of these play spaces are suitable for neurodiverse children. You know, some of them may be right out dangerous. At the same time, there are groups of people who are creating specialized play spaces for people who are neurodiverse, but the gap is so large. So I think really the need is to bridge that and see how we can bring these small elements in commonly accessed spaces and processes. Yeah, so yes, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
That's terrific, Nithya. I'll get you to jump in there, Nicole, because we've had reference to Allplay a number of occasions now. And in talking about why inclusion is still so hard to do, I think the example of Allplay is a great way of getting us to an explainer of that.
Yes, so I think I've shared this story with everybody, and in case there's two people who haven't heard it, Allplay began for me as a parent of two young children, stepping out of the clinic that we've talked about today, stepping out of my research lab, stepping out of my gait research, noticing the unusual gait of children with autism, and being in the community as a person, as a citizen with children for the first time in organised sports. And a couple of things about that. One, it's a daunting thing, even if your children are typically developing. And so if your children have disabilities or challenges, it must be terribly confronting. As the story goes, I was standing there watching AFL Auskick for the first time and watching my children play, and everything just hit me at once in an aha moment. It was first watching my children benefit socially, communication, language. You could almost see parts of their brain turning on. I was in awe of the role of that organised sport to do that. Second, for my husband and I, having that social connection, new friends that we didn't have before. And then thirdly, absolute despair as a clinician and researcher, thinking the world was built better than it was. There wasn't one child out of the swarm of hundreds of children with a disability who was at the game that day. It absolutely floored me. I didn't walk out of my lab that week. I jumped out of it and into looking at the topic we're talking about today, which is inclusion in the community, because if we spend billions of dollars on research only on the medical model and we don't think about what next in the actual community, we don't get impact. So what is Allplay? Allplay is addressing the simple and the complex of inclusion. The simple is that inclusion isn't rocket science. And as everyone's spoken about today, what we realised when we started conversations, and our first conversation was the Australian Football League for our international colleagues. We often talk about the AFL as bigger than religion in Australia. We do love our football. When we started talking, everybody was keen to have more inclusive clubs, to be more inclusive, but nobody knew where to start. And so what we realised is that there was this incredible opportunity to join the dots, from research to people with lived experience to the coaches, and to simply put what we'd studied and learnt in research about social, motor and communication into simple language that a coach could use on the day, in that moment, to support a child. So that's the simple. The complex was, of course, recognising that even if you do that, even if you provide education for coaches, for parents and for young people to break those barriers down, it's not enough. It's not enough, because the complex is, if you're a young person and you have autism, you're likely to have high levels of anxiety. Your parents are also likely to have experienced distress about bad experiences about being in the community. And so in addition to addressing the simple, Allplay addresses the complex, and that's developing stepping stone programs. So we have a program called Pre-Learn, where we shift everything we've learnt in the lab, at hospitals, in a clinic, and put it into the community in a seamless way to break down barriers and help young people take a first step.
It's a brilliant program, and you can go online to allplay.org. Is that where you find it?
That's right.
Yeah. Allplay.org will take you there, and and you can allplay.org.au, and that's a great example of it. I want to turn to you, Simon, if I can, and maybe using the example of how you totally recreate something called Auskick, which is how where kids learn to play footy together. But let's take it back to the school as well. Do you need to get buy-in and ownership of inclusion by the wider community that you're dealing with, whether it be the school community or the sport community? And if you do, what does that look like?
Well, that's the key question. I think it is. And we've been talking about inclusion as such a positive force. But what we do also have to recognise is there are a lot of people who are incredibly threatened by the concept of inclusion and diversity. We've even seen studies where just the mere mention, even subliminal mention of the word diversity or inclusion, actually provides quite a defensive reaction in people who are quite privileged and in dominant areas of society.
Well, it's not helped by the fact that it's highly politicised in some places, and particularly in Australia right now.
That's right, it is politicised. And so as a consequence, and so we know it's very fundamental. And so then the question sort of partly becomes, well, how do we create a society where we fundamentally, genuinely opens diversity? because there's so many facets of society that actually diminish our openness. So just as one simple example, there's some studies that have shown that when people feel very busy, and they just don't feel they have the time, then their motivation is just to feel good. We just don't want problems. You know, everything should be fine. And so they actually don't respond particularly well to someone or something that just differs to their expectations, differs to their norms. They're very sensitive to that gap that Jonathan talked about. Whereas when actually people do have time, their fundamental motivation is more to develop. They want to change and grow and extend themselves. And so they really embrace many of these practices that everyone's been discussing. But the problem is in modern society, people feel busy. And that's a real barrier for some of the issues and suggestions we've been discussing.
Yeah. After all these years, why are we still not satisfied with inclusion? What needs to change? Can I get you to jump in there, Chris, on that?
Oh, well, it's a quick answer. We have data that tells us that we could be doing far better. I guess, for instance, we know that of autistic people, we know that autistic people are 34.3%, unemployed within Australia, which is 7.5 times higher than Australians without a disability. We know that autistic young people are 9 times more likely to attempt self-injury in Australia. I don't know the data in other countries. So we know we could be doing far better. The data tells us.
I want to throw a provocation out here, though, and I might get you, Rajuta, first of all, to respond to that. What if inclusion, as we have defined it so far, and particularly in the mainstream educational setting, what if it isn't the answer? I just want to give a quick example. A friend of mine who, because of the pandemic, they left Victoria, which was, in the grip of lockdowns, and the child moved schools, and actually for the first time left mainstream education, child on the spectrum, and went to a special education school. A totally changed child as a result of being there, happier, calmer, much more truly herself, but expressing now many more obvious atypical traits and behaviours that are, of course, common to ASD, but might not be as well tolerated in the previous mainstream school, leading her to conclude that the child had been working terribly hard all this time to mask all of those expressions and to present as normal as possible. Was inclusion the right approach before?
I think that's a good question. And I think it has to do with a lot of what we've been discussing this evening, which is, I do still think inclusion is, or working toward inclusion is the right answer. I think it's the education of those in our community, our providers, our teachers, about autism, about what it is, and each individual. I think that's the fundamental part. So I still think inclusion is the answer. But, to add to that, I also think if we are in a situation where those individuals aren't educated in the right manner, or the environment is not in a way going to best support that autistic individual, then we do have to think about different environments or scenarios which would be better for that individual. And I say that, I don't want to say with trepidation but because it's so individualistic, and because I come across that so much in my clinic, where so many times parents come to me and say, I don't want my autistic child in an autism specific classroom. This is not the right setting for them. Some of these kids don't have as much language as my child. Some of these kids have intellectual disability, my child does not. And they're correct, they're right. But the alternative is maybe a classroom that has not been adapted to support their child. So then the question becomes, what is the best? Is inclusion in that arena the best thing? Likely not. And that becomes a really individualized and sometimes difficult discussion, where we even have to discuss the fact that if we move toward inclusion, it could be, as you mentioned, so difficult because that child themselves may mask those things. They may, in some cases, if we haven't identified some difficulties, learning disabilities, intellectual disability, they may get left behind as they're trying to mask and everyone else is moving along and the teacher isn't recognizing that. So I still think inclusion is the answer, but it fundamentally gets back to education of providers, of breaking down some of these barriers in the school. But what I'll also add to that, as I've heard sort of discussion and I've kind of self-reflected through these years, is despite the fact of being a behavioral child neurologist, we call this, right? I went through many years of training to treat autistic individuals. It wasn't until I started engaging really at a more meaningful level with these children, with their families, and in all honesty, with our Autistic Researchers Review Board as a part of some of my research study, that I realized even some of the barriers perhaps I had in my mind, right, that I had not addressed yet, or recognizing that in some of the language, even maybe unintentionally that I'm using, or the focus, like I said, not only on deficits, but what is wrong, what's not working, what therapies that we need, can in and of itself create some of these barriers. So I think education, even of providers, is really, really important to be able to help parents navigate inclusion, when and where, and how does that look for each child.
Can I get you to jump in there as well, Jonathan? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I like what Rajita's saying an awful lot, because it needs to be tailored to the individual child. And I think if we have our own adult neurotypical aspirations for inclusion and force that upon a particular individual, you're in danger of actually creating a damaging situation. So it's not just that we ought to have an ideal and we ought to therefore put into practice that ideal no matter what, because that's not the reality. The reality is that we're not at the place where we want to be to give the best inclusive practice that we know can be the best situation. That's not the reality in most places. So inclusion is an aspiration. It reminded me of, I can't remember which US president or ex-president said this, but democracy is an aspiration. Democracy is not a fixed thing that we have already. It's an ideal that we're striving for, is equal representation of all people. And in a sense, inclusion is not dissimilar from that. We want to be able to include everybody in ordinary practice, but the reality is that it's a difficult job, and we're not there in most places for it. So to force it and to be idealistic about it can be damaging. And I think that's something that we need to be cautious about.
I know you wanted to speak this evening about the intersubjectivity that's so important when it comes to the autistic child, and really indeed any child and any person, when it comes to the kind of communication that we yearn for and we hopefully are working towards in our maturation and our maturing process. Are there any reflections you want to offer on that here that might give us a better understanding as we work towards inclusion?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the one way to ensure that the inclusive practice is not forced. So this intersubjective dynamic is what I was reflecting on, talking about movement being expressive. Yeah. So when we express ourselves in body movement, the partner implicitly understands the feelings and the intentions in those body movements. That's disrupted in autism. There's a bit of a gap. So to bridge that gap, it requires the adult or the professional practitioner to move in step with that particular child, which means moving their position, their mind from where it normally is in everyday practice, and adjusting that to come to the level of the child. Yes. And to begin to understand, to be able to understand them. And then you repair that gap and you generate intersubjectivity again. And you can get through any potential mask, right? And this is the danger that Rajita is pointing to, is that we just mask any difficulties, and then the child is forced to internalize and bear them. And they can come out in later life with mental health issues, and of course the pain of living through that in the time and behaving properly, but not feeling like they're actually engaged. So if we understand intersubjectivity better, we can avoid that problem, because we can then create genuine relationships that are affective as well as functional.
We've got a great observation here from Kim Burley from the audience, saying, and it follows on exactly from what you're saying there, Jonathan, I guess one of the challenges in creating a sense of belonging is making sure it's a two-way street where all the parties listen to each other. I've got, I guess, a much cruder way of putting that, and it just seems to me that all the work is done in this relationship by the person who starts off the relationship with the deficit, or with, you know, fewer teaspoons, to use the teaspoon analogy, fewer filled teaspoons, whereas the person who has the greater capacity, or it requires less of them to do the work to understand and to build a bit more of the bridge of understanding and connection, is doing no work at all. So whereas the child could go off to several hours of OT, several hours of speech therapy, several hours of movement therapy, if I could actually just take the neurotypical person aside and in half an hour say, understand this, just know that, try not to do that, it's really good if you do this and this helps, they've actually saved that person a whole lot of hours and hours and hours of clinical practice. You're nodding. Jonathan, go quickly, and I'll go to you, Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the very issue, is that kind of intervention that you're describing of putting all the onus on the child so the child can be fixed. You know, this is ridiculous. I mean, it's not the case, and this is what the conversation I think has been about a lot today, is acceptance that in fact neurodiversity is perfectly fine, and even though the child may be different, it's not necessarily a deficit. And I wouldn't even use that language, because it's different, and differences create strengths in other areas, insights in other areas that the neurotypical person may not have or will not have. So we need to understand that that person is different. We accept, and we spend the time and move our prejudices aside and reconfigure our normal thinking to begin to bridge that gap, to understand that particular child. And then we can give the best inclusive practice, and we might not need all those therapies.
Nicole?
Yeah, I was listening to this part of the conversation and smiling, because there was a family I was speaking to the other day, and a little boy was going to his third primary school because he was unhappy at the first two. And everything really worked out well at the third primary school in the first week. And I asked the mum, you know, what was it? What did this school do? What was the magic? Because this little boy had such a difficult time. And she said they just set it up well. So there was a young person to greet my son and have a conversation. Then they came in and the receptionist knew what to say. Everybody in the community was prepared and had an activity in a way of making this young person have a sense of belonging in the first hour. And that's all he needed. It wasn't rocket science, which I think is sort of summarizes the theme. And then my other reflection is, we know that we're on track. So in this situation, in this scenario, for getting close to inclusion, when we stop being crisis driven, you know, we put so much social, financial, emotional energy into putting out fires and being crisis driven when inclusion doesn't work, that we're not putting our time, resource and research into what's successful, because there are so many success stories out there. We're not building, nourishing or amplifying that. We're still putting the vast majority of our resources into a crisis different approach. So when that pendulum starts to swing, we know that we're making gains.
Did you want to jump in there, Chris, and say something?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there's just fantastic gains that have particularly been made by what we call primary schools in Australia. So for students aged 6 to 12, there's some fantastic case studies of inclusion across schools, such as the third school you've identified there. We do focus so much on the negatives, and it perpetuates people's perception that it's not going well. But yeah, I mean, we just have so many great examples in Australia of autistic-led pioneering approaches that have made a huge difference. So I agree, when that pendulum swings, we know we're doing well.
Simon, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I'm sort of intrigued also by your idea of speaking to the neurotypical child for half an hour and what effect that might have. And I can sort of see
I'm thinking, just to jump in there, so I'm thinking of the neurotypical adult, frankly.
Absolutely.
Just saying, you've got all the capacity in the world. You can carry the can here because it won't kill you. And if you make 3/4 of the effort, requiring less effort from the autistic child, this relationship's going to go a lot better.
Absolutely. But I mean, in a way, there are both supporting forces and competing forces. I mean, one of the competing forces is that we are living in a very competitive society. And as part of the competitive society, you know, because there's so much flux and there's so much competition for scarce resources, we just naturally develop this sense of a hierarchy. We always think there's people on the top of the hierarchy and there's the bottom of the hierarchy. And we also want to believe that's fair, which is clearly not fair. I mean, everyone knows it's not, but we like to believe it's fair. And so sometimes unconsciously, we just have this pressure to almost denigrate someone who's not at the top of the hierarchy. And to sort of make, and to feel better about ourselves by being high. So I mean, I was thinking more for the child. There's a lot of pressure because the child's got a lot of pressure sometimes from parents inadvertently pushing them to be just, to be at the top of a hierarchy, and therefore not necessarily to embrace diversity. But on the other hand, the more positive side to that is that it's amazing how malleable we are. Like sometimes people might be uncomfortable with someone who's autistic or any form of diversity, but it doesn't take much skill in that area, just a little bit of exposure, feeling like this is becoming a strength. I've learned how to interact with a broader range of person, and then defining ourselves as a strength suddenly makes that something that people are fundamentally interested in. Like our interests and values can change quite dramatically with just small feelings of that it becomes a strength.
Yeah. Nithya, did you want to jump in there?
Thank you. So I was just listening to everybody speaking, and I thought now almost every country has legislation that mandates inclusion in one way or the other. And that can be a double-edged sword, because like we're talking, many educational spaces can take in children who are neurodiverse, but like Rujita was mentioning earlier, there could be a fear of, what do we do? Do we do something wrong? Are we going to hurt these children by doing things that are not going to be helpful? And so while efforts on inclusion are being furthered, it may be very, very crucial to have conversational spaces amongst children, among educators, across the board with various stakeholders, just to see what's on everybody's mind, rather than telling people this is what you need to do. Because it's really unpacking a lot of beliefs and attitudes, various emotions, and then facts and what to do. So I think it may be useful in that process to just keep making efforts for more and more conversation, rather than saying this is right and this is wrong and this is what should be done or shouldn't be done. So that's just what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Nithya, and I might get you to stay there, because this is a comment from an audience member, Chris J. I find educators do not like to be pushed out of their everyday practices. When I challenge them in changing key strategies for one child, they are often not open to this. What's the best approach here, do you think, Nithya?
Yes, I think even with groups of neurotypical children, this does not hold good. What strategy works well with 10 children may not work well with the 11th child. And it is hard for the adult, I say in charge, to try and do something different, because they're under a lot of different kinds of pressure. So what we have found useful in these situations is to first give that adult some space to share what they're going through, validate their experience, because it's often not intentional. It's not that they don't want to help this child who has different needs. It's just that they are not in a space where they can access those. And then to generate solutions with them. Often also just having a peer group with whom they can consult and with whom they can generate new ideas is helpful. So it's not unusual, is what I would like to say. That as adults, we often want templates that will work over and over again. It's hard for many of us to try something new in the moment. It's not different for a teacher who has to handle a bunch of young children. And so then to see how can we create more support for them to do that more comfortably. Thank you.
Many questions are coming in, and remember, you can go on Slido and put your question in there and upvote the questions you'd most like to hear asked as well. So do that if anything's occurring to you right now. There's one here for you, Chris, but Rajut, I'd love to get you to respond to this as well. What's the best way to advocate for our children at school? Any tips or advice? It follows on really from that observation by Chris J. and Nithya's response too.
I think firstly, the first practical tip would be working with your child to create a bit of a learning profile that's developed by them. So you could call it like an all about me. You could invite your child to make a name for it. Basically, if you can put on a piece of paper something creative and colourful, whether your child is talking about their interests, what makes them feel safe at school, what's some helpful prompts to start with, what teachers can do to kind of create a relationship. Are you talking to a young person that knows a lot about history? Can you begin the class day asking them about what they've learnt about that particular subject, whether it's the First Fleet or whether it's World War II, whatever it is. The more you can write down on a piece of paper the personality of your child and what their different autistic intuition looks like, the more you will bring that teacher leaning in to that child's unique processing style. I think that's my main practical tip. I've always seen that make a big difference.
Rajuta, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example, Chris. And I'll actually add something very similar, but from the clinician side. And what I'll say is, I think have your clinician, if you may be working with, I come from the perspective as a child neurologist, help advocate with you. You know, oftentimes I feel, or I should say, I have the privilege to consider these children, you know, part of my own family. I consider these families my families, and I know them very well. And so what I'll say is, being that advocate or helping to be that advocate can be powerful. I can honestly say a 20-minute phone call with a child's teacher or provider can go far beyond any clinical notes that I may write to, or any standardized testing. Not to diminish that, that's incredibly important, but standardized testing doesn't always capture the abilities of the children that we care for. Oftentimes, particularly in autistic individuals with motor difficulties or with intellectual difficulties, it's actually not really capturing their full ability the way these tests are made. So having that clinician advocate for you and have that phone call to really describe what are the strengths, what are the areas of difficulties. And then I'll just make a comment, you know, this could differ from country to country, but on the US side, for example, when it comes to motor, physical therapy in the school, once the child can safely access a playground, that often means walk, that therapy goes away. But what you heard from Jonathan here tonight and others, you know, that motor signature, that motor difference goes far beyond that ability to walk. So having a clinician get on the phone and explain some of those things can really go far in helping advocate and support the child in the school.
Rajuta, is it a red flag at a school if you've got a teacher or a principal or perhaps the special ed teacher who resists the direct conversation with someone like you?
So I look at it in two ways. I think, yes, I guess to really answer, it makes me nervous. Can I say as much as red flag? I think initially it does worry me if they're not open to that conversation. But then I start thinking about, so yes, but some of the things that Nithya pointed out, which is this fear or difficulty or inability to feel like they have the bandwidth or the ability or are harnessed with the knowledge to be able to support this child. So it worries me, but then I try to approach it in a different way, understanding or recognizing what they might be working with, what resources they may not have, and then trying to work with them to identify what resources might be needed and recognizing that sometimes it's not a great deal of things. It's really just some pointed, targeted things that might help out of an individual.
Nicole, I might put this next question to you. How can we better prepare? I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on special education settings and the role that they play as barriers to inclusion. We kind of touched on this before about whether, you know, the special ed setting actually ends up being helpful or in some settings actually not what the child needs. What do you think, Nicole?
Two things. First of all, choice. Everybody should have a choice about how they want to be educated. Some families choose homeschooling even on medical grounds, and that's something you can do. And that choice is important. And we've seen, particularly post-pandemic, that many families have started doing that. It's choice. There's no judgment on that choice. On special education. I lost my train of thought for a second, Virginia. The other I guess important point to make here is that I think it was Chris, I can't remember somebody said that for some children, they're so distressed in a mainstream setting. And now I'm not sure how well set up that mainstream setting is. I'm not sure if it was one thing or multiple issues, but they're so distressed that their mental health is at risk. And I've seen those children sometimes move to a special setting, a different special autistic school, and they are happy. They're happy for the first time in their school. And when I think about what inclusion is, I actually think about the rules of happiness, you know, something to do, someone to love, something to hope for. And so I think, so choice, but also we need to recognize that there are times where, for whatever the reason, whatever the jurisdiction, that mainstream school isn't working for all children.
Jonathan, did you want to say something here?
Only to reiterate the point that I think, you know, total inclusion is an aspiration and may not be a reality. So I think that the idea for choice and to have a sense of best outcome for that particular child in this particular moment in society is really important. So in Glasgow, we have an unfortunate situation where we, because of legislation, every child has to go to primary school, even though the nursery teachers and the transition teachers into primary school are very clear that the school that they're going to be transitioning into will not be suitable and that child will fail. And unfortunately, that's the legislated situation. So it's probably, it doesn't look ethically the correct choice to make. So I think we need to have a sense of reality about what's going to be possible in the particular situation at a particular moment in time.
Simon, I might put this question to you. How can we better prepare teachers to support students with autism when they begin formal schooling? What about students who display characteristics of autism but don't yet have a diagnosis? So I guess getting to the teaching of teachers earlier on this particular subject.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, one of the fundamental, I think, barriers for a lot of teachers is the notion that they're not always encouraged to be humble. I mean, again, we're living in a world where we don't like being humble. We like to pretend that we know what we're doing. And teachers sometimes even more so, because they're often challenged by difficult parents. And so they have to sort of show they know what they're doing. And that's a shame, because I think that the ideal teacher is one that's quite happy to acknowledge that they don't know what to do. I mean, with the family, even with a child potentially, they really want to listen, that they're a collaborator in this process. And I think encouraging an environment where teachers can do that will take a bit of work, I think.
Nithya, anything you'd like to add there?
Yes, I think it would be very important to include discussions around neurodiversity in teacher training, because a lot of training probably looks at core academic content and how it's to be taught, learning styles and so on, but just to also look at what neurodiversity is and how it can show itself in many ways, right from preschool on to primary school, high school, higher education settings. I think it's important to begin creating spaces for those discussions and conversations. And so that, you know, as educators, one is more open to say, yes, I don't know, I want to learn more. How could this be done? Rather than saying, oh, this is difficult, this cannot be done, move the person out. You know, so I'm guessing that could be a useful starting point, so that it's really a collaboration of various stakeholders. And it's a process. It's not a one-time training, or it's not a one-time education, but it's a long-term process of collectively learning.
Yeah. There's a comment here from Jennifer Mock. I want to go to Chris Varney about this particular question in just a moment, but just to read this out, and Jennifer Mock, if you're still there, maybe you might be able to just amplify on this, and I can read this out to everyone streaming today. Jennifer's comment is re-collaboration. With communication being so difficult for all of my family, it's been so hard to get the right support. The breakthrough has been to think outside the box about communication. Jennifer, if you could just tell us a little bit more about what the thinking outside the box, or the different modes you've decided to use around communication that have been useful to you are, then I can actually share that with the, oh, here we go. I think it's just coming in now. What's helped is a specialist in facilitation and group work. Accessing and working well with health professionals, schools and other supports needs lots of effective communication. So specialist in facilitation and group work there. Does anyone want to sort of just step in and make a comment about that? Just whack your hand up if you think it's yours, about how that can be useful in that setting. Is that you, Simon?
No, it definitely wasn't. Possibly to say that it's a very difficult game, is communication, partly because one of the easy defaults, as we've sort of been mentioning before, is to really listen and to provide choice. For example, choice to parents about even like the decisions about whether to be placed in a special school or not. But actually, one of the complications, of course, is that parents really struggle with choice. I mean, they might want choice on the one hand, but they're also quite scared. And being able to sort of subtly navigate that in communication, knowing what people need and how to adjust to that is really quite difficult.
Yeah. Chris, did you want to just say something briefly about what might be useful for teachers as they embark on their training when they're ultimately going to end up in the classroom with kids on the spectrum?
Two things. I think it's very powerful when you have autistic people, including non-speaking autistic people, who deliver professional development workshops in schools or who go to universities and speak to teachers who are in training. And secondly, I just want to acknowledge there is a lot of work being done to try and make the transition of secondary learners in Australia into their post-school studies to try and make that pathway more flexible. There's only 2 jurisdictions who are really stepping into it. But I guess to address Jennifer's question, the key thing that needs to change is ensuring that, for our 17 and 18-year-olds in Australia who are completing their secondary studies, we need to see far more flexibility around language differences so that the great work that Jennifer's talking about does actually, continue. And those young people do experience a more flexible assessment to help them with their post-school study.
Okay. I know that in particular, Jonathan, before we finished this evening, you wanted to talk about next steps, or perhaps we could call it reasons to be cheerful, to quote Ian Drury from many, many years ago. Is there any reflections you'd like to make that sort of point us towards what you're focusing on now, Jonathan, and what the path forward might be for inclusion and reasons to be a bit optimistic?
Well, I think the center of our cartoon board, says it all. It's fostering the sense of belonging. And I think we've learned through the conversation that it's some simple principles that are really critical to this. And it's that belonging, it's the acceptance, it's the acknowledgement of the importance of intersubjectivity, which is at the heart of communication. It might not be the language and the technical aspects of language, but it's the feeling of being with another person and having a common understanding, doing a shared project together, stacking cubes or whatever, adapting to the child so that the school and the curriculum adapts to the child. We did a wonderful review that looked at 18 studies. They all showed that when you adapt the curriculum to this restricted interest of an autistic individual, that autistic individual will begin to flourish and learn. So it's all of these things, and and kind of behind all of this is a bit of a bugbear about resource and time and competitiveness, and I really do think that we need to continue the discussion with our governments to understand that education needs to be resourced, that teachers need to feel that they have that 20 minutes to speak to their clinical neurologist about the child in their classroom, and that's a worthy and good thing to do. So I think we do need to slow down, have a bit more time to consider these things and to generate those relationships and common understanding that will enable that inclusive practice to work.
Rajuti, would you like to add something there?
Yeah, well, I do think Jonathan has summarized this beautifully, but I also think, Jennifer, who made the comment in our questions, which is thinking outside of the box also, even as a clinician, it's not always about how we were trained, to think about treatment and about communication and about services. It's thinking about other ways that we can support each unique, amazing child that we see in our clinic. What is going to be the best approach for them? And if I don't know, how can I learn a little bit more about what is out there to support them? And I think when you think outside the box like that, it offers you an opportunity to also grow and build other programs that we work on. I think as Nicole and I have had a wonderful opportunity to work together on these adaptive sports program. And I think if we hadn't thought outside of the box, or at least say on our end, then we wouldn't have grown these things. And it's been such a positive experience. And so I think many of us on this panel have probably done something similar. Thank you.
Nithya, what would you like to add?
Well, it's just been wonderful having this conversation, and I think my head is buzzing with more questions at the moment about what this means for communities around, and what it means also for me as an individual. What would be my own process of continuing to look at how I see inclusion, barriers to it, thinking out of the box. It's really been so invigorating to be part of this conversation. So yeah, thank you.
I'm very glad you've been here. Nicole, what are your reflections?
Look, I'm very optimistic about the future. I'm excited about the future. When I did my PhD at Monash 20 years ago, we only had the medical model. Nobody was talking about the community or social. Nobody was talking about talking to teachers and the intersections between psychology and education. There was no Medicare OT speech in Australia, mental health for children with autism. There was no NDIS. And now, not only do we have those really growing wonderful supports for autistic children, but in Victoria, we have our minister announced disability inclusion in 2021, and it picks up on a lot of the discussion we've talked about in terms of more resourcing, more time for teachers, more professional development, so that we can be less crisis-driven and more optimistic and strengths-based going forward. And strengths-based is the future of education for children with autism. The problem is we're all impatient and we want it yesterday, but I'm optimistic that things are getting better.
Simon?
Yeah, I'm also optimistic, not just for schools, but also as autistic children and adolescents grow up and go to the workplace. I'm quite optimistic that workplaces will become a lot more accepting and embracing of just differences in general, including of autism, partly because we know that those workplaces that really embrace differences are the best workplaces for everyone. People enjoy them more, and the reason partly is because they feel connected to a workplace that embraces diversity, feels a sense of belonging, but allows them, each individual, to be unique as well, which is something that's often missing in organisations. So hopefully managers will recognise that soon and embrace everyone in the future.
Chris, final comment from you?
Yeah, I feel very, very positive. I think we've got big government departments and companies coming out with big goals and aspirations around inclusion. I'm seeing that translate to targets, which is just a personal interest of mine. And in my company, ICANN Network, we have a 50% target to see 50% of our staff who are autistic. So yeah, I think it's a great time to be talking about this. Good things are going to happen.
It definitely feels like it's the best possible time that we could, as you say, Nicole, compared to 5, 10, 15, 20 years before. It's been wonderful to have you all here, wherever you might be streaming. Please, a round of applause that we can hear right around the globe for Simon Moss and for Nithya Purnima, Rajuta Wilson, Chris Farney, Nicole Reinhardt and Jonathan Delafield. But thank you, all of you. And thanks so much for being here and your thoughtful contributions, and for everyone's contribution on chat and questions as well. This was the final Global Critical Conversation, but we do have still a couple of other public events for this year. One is a discussion of UNESCO's Futures of Education Initiative report, Can Learning Shape the Future of Humanity and the Planet?, which will be a great conversation, and also Understanding Young People in Australia Today, the 2021 Australian Youth Barometer. And we'll include the links in the YouTube chat comments to both of those events. Thank you everyone for being here this evening. It's been really wonderful.